I hadn't touched a spreadsheet in 14 months, and I told myself that was a good thing. Retirement was supposed to be quiet. Coffee at 6, garden by 7, the newspaper by 8, and by 9 I was usually down at the dock, checking the level markers the way other men check their blood pressure. Alder Lake didn't ask anything of me. That was the whole appeal. Margaret used to say I counted things the way other people breathed, without noticing I was doing it. She wasn't wrong. 31 years reconciling other people's lies for a living does that to a man. It leaves a kind of residue. Even now, almost 2 years after the funeral, I still catch myself totaling the days since I lost her. The way you'd tally an overdue invoice. I saw Renata Cole on my way back from the mailbox on a Tuesday in April, the ice barely off the shallows. She was out walking her dog along the shore road, bundled against a wind that hadn't gotten the memo about spring, and she waved me down before I could pretend I hadn't seen her. "You must be proud," she said, smiling in that easy way she had. "Proud of what?" "Ethan's project. Harbor Point." She said it like I should already know. "I signed my paperwork last week." My advisor said having your name attached gave her a lot more confidence in the numbers. "Coming from you, that means something around here." I remember the wind doing something strange to my hearing just then. A kind of static behind her voice. "My name," I said carefully. "Attached how?" "On the guarantor page. The one with your license number." She must have seen something shift in my face, because her smile faltered. "Walter, you did know about that, didn't you?" I told her of course I did. I've built a career out of saying true things and false things in the same even tone, and old habits are the last to leave a man. But I stood there on the shoulder of that road for a long moment after she'd walked on, feeling the cold work its way up through my boots, because I had signed nothing. I had not so much as glanced at a single page of my son's business in over a year. Ethan and I talked. Technically. Sunday phone calls that lasted 6 minutes, sometimes 8 if the Tigers had played well. He always sounded like a man selling something, even to his own father, bright, quick, full of momentum, already halfway to the next sentence before I'd finished the last one. I used to think that was just Ethan being Ethan. After Margaret died, I stopped being sure I knew what was just Ethan being Ethan and what was something else wearing his voice. I didn't call him that afternoon. I went home instead and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink, turning Renata's words over the way you turn a coin looking for the flaw in it. Then I did what I have done for 3 decades whenever something didn't sit right in my chest. I went and found the paper. The county's permitting portal was clumsier than anything I'd used in my working life, but it didn't take much digging. Harbor Point Development, 42 lakefront units, Phase 1 groundbreaking targeted for winter. And there, on the 3rd page of the guarantor disclosures, next to a state license number for financial attestation, was mine. Walter A. Nash. CFE license 04417MI. My credential, the one I'd carried since 1994, the one that used to mean something in courtrooms from Traverse City to Lansing, sitting under my son's project like a support beam I'd never agreed to pour. I went and got the actual license from the drawer in my study, the laminated card I hadn't looked at in years, and set it beside the printed page under the desk lamp. The numbers matched. Every digit. I sat there a long time. Long enough that the house went from gray to black around me, and I never got up to turn on another light. There's a particular kind of stillness that comes over a room at 2 in the morning when you're the only one awake in it, and grief has a way of making that stillness louder instead of quieter. I was at Margaret's old roll-top desk by then, the one she used for the church bulletin and the garden club minutes, because it was the only surface in the house that still felt like it belonged to someone who told the truth. Out past the window, the lake was just a suggestion of black on black. And somewhere out there was 42 units of my son's future sitting on a foundation with my name poured into it. I told myself there could be an explanation. Paperwork gets sloppy. A firm cuts a corner, borrows a credential from a related party without thinking too hard about consent, corrects it later with an apology and a fee. I have believed stranger things in my life. I built a career on knowing which explanations were true and which ones were just well-dressed, and some part of me, the part that still loved my son without complication, wanted badly to believe this was the first kind, so I kept looking, because that's what 31 years trains into you. You don't stop at the first document. You ask what else is behind it. It took me until almost 4 in the morning, cross-referencing the county's public filings against the state licensing board's own records, before I found the second one. A private placement memorandum, filed with investors directly rather than the county, for a second phase of the same project, larger, more ambitious, nearly triple the capital of the first. And there, in the section meant to reassure people that their money was safe, was my name again. Not just my license number this time. A full paragraph, describing decades of forensic accounting experience, describing me, in language I had never written and never approved, as if I were standing behind this thing with my whole reputation. Wide awake and willing, I hadn't been asked. I hadn't been told. I had been used, in ink, while I slept. I didn't sleep. By 6 I'd made a pot of coffee I had no intention of finishing and started doing what I used to do for clients who couldn't sleep either, the ones who called at odd hours convinced someone was moving money they hadn't authorized. I always told them the same thing. Feelings don't hold up in front of a judge. Documents do. So I went and got documents. The licensing board had a portal for verifying credential usage, the kind of thing meant for employers checking a contractor's certifications, not for a man checking up on his own name. It took 3 tries to remember my password. When I finally got in, there was a usage log I hadn't known existed, a record of every entity that had requested verification of my CFE license in the past 18 months. 6 requests. 2 from institutions I recognized, routine renewals through my old professional association. For I didn't recognize at all, I wrote each one down on a legal pad, the way I used to log exhibits. Then I pulled my credit report, something I hadn't bothered with in years because there was never any reason to. 2 soft inquiries showed up from commercial lenders I'd never done business with, both within the last 4 months, both flagged as guarantor verification, non-borrower. By 9 that morning I had 3 separate filings laid out across the kitchen table. Weighted down with coffee mugs so the wind off the porch door wouldn't scatter them. The permit disclosure from the county. The private placement memorandum for Harbor Point's second phase. And now a third, a personal guarantee rider attached to a construction draw loan from Lakeshore Regional Bank, $600,000 released against collateral that listed my name, my license, and a net worth figure that wasn't even close to accurate, inflated by exactly the amount that would make a loan officer comfortable. 3 filings. 3 separate lies, each one built to look like the last one had already been vetted by somebody responsible. That's how you do it. If you know what you're doing, you don't invent one big fraud. You stack small credible-looking pieces until the whole structure holds its own weight. I know that because I spent 3 decades unstacking exactly this kind of thing for a living. I just never expected to find my own name at the bottom of the pile. I started a ledger that afternoon. Not out of habit, out of necessity, the same reflex that used to keep me from losing a case to my own disorganization. A yellow legal pad became a 3-ring binder by Thursday. By the following Tuesday, the binder had become a corkboard I dragged in from the garage, the kind Margaret used to pin garden club flyers to. I strung red thread between dates and dollar amounts the way I once had for a jury. Except this time there was no jury, no client, no fee. Just me, alone in a house that had been spare and quiet for 2 years, watching it fill up with paper again. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I wasn't going to move until I understood the whole shape of it, because the last thing I wanted was to accuse my own son of something and be wrong about the size of it, or worse, right about the size of it and unprepared to prove it. But some nights, standing in front of that corkboard with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, I caught myself thinking of it the way you think of a diagnosis you're not ready to say out loud. I had the test results. I just hadn't told anyone I'd had the test. Dana called that Sunday to ask if she and Ethan could bring the baby by for dinner. She said it the way she always did, warm and a little apologetic, like she was still getting used to being welcomed into a family that had lost its center before she'd fully arrived in it. I said of course. I meant it, too. Whatever my son had done, I hadn't yet found a version of Dana Nash in any of this that deserved to be caught in the middle of it. I put the binder in the hall closet before they came. Took down 2 of the pins from the corkboard and threw a bedsheet over the rest, told myself it was because I didn't want the baby getting into the pushpins, and mostly believed it. Dana looked tired in the particular way new mothers look tired. The kind that isn't really about sleep. She talked about the baby's ear infection, about a squabble with her sister over Thanksgiving plans, ordinary things, the kind of talk that used to fill this kitchen when Margaret was the one standing at the stove. Ethan was doing what Ethan does at family dinners lately, talking fast, laughing easy, refilling everyone's glass a beat before it was empty, the whole performance of a man who wanted very badly for nobody at the table to ask him a real question. Harbor Point's ahead of schedule, he said at one point, apropos of nothing, like he needed to say it out loud to believe it himself. Phase 2 paperwork's basically done. Investors are thrilled. That's so, I said, you should come see the site sometime, Dad. I keep telling you. You'd be proud. I looked at him over the rim of my glass and thought about a paragraph with my name in it that I had never written, sitting in a filing cabinet in a bank 40 minutes from where we were sitting. I'll make the time, I said, and meant it as a threat, though nobody at that table heard it as one. Dana caught something, though. Not the content, I don't think she knew anything then, not really, but the temperature of it. She looked between us twice during that exchange, quick, searching glances, the kind of thing a person does when they've been living close enough to a marriage's fault line to feel small tremors before anyone tells them what's causing them. Later, helping me clear plates, she said quietly, he's been wound up lately. The project stuff. I don't ask too much, he doesn't like the questions. She said it like an apology on his behalf, or maybe on her own. Everybody carries stress differently, I told her, which was true and also the kind of thing you say when you don't yet know how to say the truer thing. They left a little after 8. I stood on the porch and watched their taillights curve down toward the county road, the baby's car seat catching the porch light for a second before the dark took the car whole. Then I went back inside, pulled the sheet off the corkboard, and sat back down with the third filing, the Lakeshore Regional Guarantee, because something about the collateral language had been bothering me since that afternoon and I hadn't let myself look closely enough to name it. It was the co-guarantor line. A second name, listed beneath mine, meant to reinforce the same net worth claim, meant to make the whole guarantee look thicker, more credible, harder to challenge. I'd skimmed past it twice already, assuming it was some business partner of Ethan's I didn't know. I hadn't read the name carefully. I read it now, Margaret Nash. My wife had been dead for 22 months. And somewhere in that filing, dated 4 months ago, her signature sat beneath a dollar figure she never saw, backing a loan she never knew existed, for a project she'd never once been asked her opinion of while she was alive to give one. I called Ethan the next morning. Not to accuse him, I told myself that. Anyway, but to ask him to come by. I needed to see his face when I said her name. He showed up around 4. Still in his work clothes, a polo with the Harbor Point logo stitched over the breast, phone in hand like it was surgically attached. He kissed my cheek the way he always did, quick and automatic, and dropped onto the same stool at the kitchen island he'd used since he was a teenager. You sounded weird on the phone, he said. Everything okay? I didn't answer. I went to the hall closet, pulled out the binder, and set it on the island in front of him, open to the page with the Lakeshore Regional Guarantee. I watched his eyes drop to it and I watched something in his face go still. The practiced ease draining out of him in real time. Where'd you get this? He said. Not a question. Barely even words. I'm still your father, Ethan. I still have a license number. Turns out I still have a paper trail, too. I kept my voice level. 30 years of cross-examining men who thought they were smarter than the evidence taught me that the quiet voice does more damage than the loud one. Your mother's name is on this loan. She's been gone almost 2 years. You want to explain that to me? He didn't reach for the page. He looked at it like it might bite him. It's not what it looks like forgery. Tell me what it actually is. Dad, it's temporary. The bank needed a stronger guarantor package before they'd release the second draw, and I was going to fix the documentation once phase 2 closed. I swear to you, I was never going to let it actually, you were never going to let it actually what? Matter? It already matters. It's filed. It's recorded. Somebody at that bank believes my dead wife co-signed a construction loan 4 months ago. My hands were flat on the counter, and I was aware of them shaking slightly, the kind of tremor I hadn't felt since my last real trial. How long has this been going on? He looked down at the granite, at some point past it, like the answer was written on the floor beneath his feet. A year. Little over, year, after the Cedar Ridge collapse, he stopped himself, the way a man stops when he said more than he meant to. Cedar Ridge, I repeated. I knew the name only vaguely, some development downstate that had gone under before Harbor Point ever broke ground. I hadn't known Ethan's name was anywhere near it. What was Cedar Ridge? It doesn't matter, it matters plenty if it's why my name is on $600,000 of debt. He finally looked up, and for a second I saw something underneath the developer's polish, something scared, something closer to the boy who used to bring me broken things to fix. I put everything into Cedar Ridge. Everything. My savings, a chunk of Dana's inheritance, money I shouldn't have touched. It failed before it ever got out of the ground, some environmental review killed it 18 months in, and I was left holding debt nobody was ever going to let me refinance under my own name again. Nobody. I had one shot left to prove I wasn't the guy who torched his own family's money on a bad idea, and it was Harbor Point, and the only way the banks would even look at me again was if there was a name behind it they trusted. Your name, Dad. Not mine. Yours, so you took it. I was going to earn it back before anyone ever needed to know it was borrowed. You don't borrow a person's name, Ethan. You ask for it. And they say yes or they say no, and either way it's still theirs when the conversation's over. What you did was take it in the dark and hope I never found the light switch. He didn't have an answer for that. He sat there working his jaw, and for a moment I almost believed the silence was going to turn into an apology. I want it unwound, I said. Every filing. Every guarantee. I want my name and your mother's name off every document in that project by the end of the month, and I want to see it done, not promised. That's not, Dad, you don't understand how construction financing works. You pull a guarantor mid-project and the bank calls the whole note, the whole site goes dark. 40 families lose their deposits, then you should have thought of that before you built the site on a lie. I'll fix it, he said, standing now, his voice climbing. Give me time. A few months. I can restructure it clean, get real investors in behind it, get you off the paper the right way instead of blowing the whole thing up. I've already given you a year you didn't tell me about. How much more time did you have in mind? I don't know. I don't know. Okay, I need you to not go to the licensing board before I've had a chance to fix this myself. There it was. Not remorse. Strategy. I felt something in my chest go cold and clear, the exact sensation I used to get in a courtroom the moment a witness stopped telling the truth and started managing me instead. I haven't said anything about the licensing board, I said quietly. You will. You're already halfway there, I can see it in your face. He was pacing now, hands dragging through his hair, and for one flash of a second I saw exactly how frightened he was. Underneath the charm, underneath the good suit and the firm handshake, a man who believed, all the way down, that one more public failure would be the end of him. It didn't excuse anything. But it explained a great deal. I need to think, I told him, which was true, and also the only thing I could say that didn't sound like a threat or a surrender. He left without finishing the conversation, the way he always did when a conversation stopped going his way. I stood at the window and watched his truck pull out of the driveway too fast, gravel spitting from the tires, and I told myself I'd bought myself time to decide what came next. I hadn't bought anything. I found that out over the following 2 weeks, in small pieces, the way you find out you're sick, not from one clear symptom, but from a string of things that don't add up until suddenly they do. It started at the hardware store. Frank Delgado had sold me lumber and lakehouse hardware for 11 years, ever since Margaret and I put the addition on the porch, and he'd never once looked at me the way he looked at me that Tuesday, like he was handling something fragile, something that might crack if he wasn't careful with his voice. You doing all right, Walter? He asked, ringing up a box of deck screws I didn't especially need. Ethan mentioned you'd been having a rough stretch. Since Margaret, I'm fine, Frank, sure. Just, you let us know if you need anything, alright? Whole town's thinking about you. I didn't understand it then. I drove home turning the exchange over, the particular gentleness of it, the way pity dresses itself up as concern. It happened again at the post office 2 days later, the clerk asking me twice if I was sure about the address on a package, in a tone that suggested she wasn't asking about the address at all. And again at church, where 2 women I'd known 30 years touched my arm a beat too long and told me how strong I was being. I thought grief did strange things to a town's memory of a man. I thought maybe I looked older than I felt. It wasn't until Dana came by on a Thursday evening, alone, without Ethan or the baby, that I understood none of it had anything to do with grief at all. She stood on the porch for a long moment before she'd come inside, and when she finally sat across from me at the kitchen table, she looked like she'd been arguing with herself the whole drive over about whether to say anything at all. He's telling people you've been confused, she said finally. Since Mom Nash passed. Forgetting things. Signing things you don't remember signing. Her hands were folded so tight her knuckles had gone pale. He told his site manager you'd gotten some paperwork mixed up in your head, and he told Frank something similar, and I think he said some version of it to half the investor list by now. Walter, I didn't know until last week. I want you to know that. I didn't know. I sat very still, feeling the shape of the last 2 weeks rearrange itself into something I finally recognized, not a town gone soft with sympathy, but a story being told about me, one careful conversation at a time, by the one person whose word people would take without asking a single question. I didn't sleep on it the way I should have. I called Priya Shah first thing the next morning instead. Priya and I had spent 11 years serving on the same regional fraud examiners board back before either of us slowed down. Back when I still had an office downtown instead of a lake view. She'd moved into compliance work at Great Lakes Trust after that, the kind of quiet institutional job where nobody notices you until something's gone wrong, and by then it's usually too late to notice anything at all. She still owed me a favor from a case in 2009 that I'd never once brought up in 15 years. I brought it up now. She agreed to meet me at a diner off the highway, someplace neither of us was likely to run into anyone from Harbor Point, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, which told me more than anything she said afterward. Priya had always been a good listener when something was actually wrong. And a terrible one when it wasn't. You understand what happens if you walk into the licensing board with this today, she said, once I'd laid it all out, the permit filing, the private placement memo, the construction guarantee with Margaret's name on it. They don't quietly ask Ethan to amend some paperwork. A credentialing fraud complaint against a project this size triggers an automatic reporting obligation on my end, and probably the bank's too, the second it's confirmed. That pulls the loan covenants. The bank has to reassess the whole capital structure of Harbor Point inside of a matter of days, not months. Good, I said. That's the point, Walter. She set her coffee down and looked at me the way she used to look at junior examiners who were about to make a mistake they couldn't take back. Do you know who's actually holding paper on this project? Not the bank's money. The private placement side. The retail investors. I didn't, not specifically, not yet. I'd been so focused on the forgery itself, on proving the thing existed, that I hadn't let myself look past it to who exactly would be standing underneath it when it came down. She had a partial list. Not the whole thing. She wasn't about to hand me confidential account information, favor or no favor, but she'd pulled together. From public filing cross-references and things she could legally discuss, a general sense of who'd bought into the second phase placement. It wasn't hedge funds. It wasn't out-of-state money looking for a tax shelter. It was people who lived within 15 miles of where we were sitting. Retired teachers. A couple who ran the marina. A widow who'd put in her husband's life insurance payout because Ethan had personally walked her through the numbers at her own kitchen table. If this collapses fast, Priya said, it collapses on them first. Not on Ethan. Ethan's already structured himself some distance from the personal liability. That's half of what the forged guarantor language was for. If I'm being honest with you, it was never really about protecting you. It was about making the deal look safe enough for people like that to sign onto it. I sat with that for a long moment, watching the coffee go cold in front of me, feeling something I recognized from 30 years of casework but had never once felt about my own family. The particular sickness of realizing the truth is more complicated than the version of it you'd already decided to be angry about. I need the full list, I said. Off the record. However you can manage it, I can't just hand you client data, Walter, favor or not. But I can tell you this. If you're thinking about going to the board, don't do it before you understand exactly who's on the other side of that decision. Because right now you're the only person who knows this is a bomb. The second you pull the pin, everyone standing near it finds out at the same time. I drove home that afternoon without the radio on, which for me is usually a sign that I already know something I haven't said out loud yet. Renata called 2 days later, asking if I wanted to come by for coffee, the way she had every few weeks since Margaret passed. More out of the kindness she'd never stopped extending to me than out of any real news to share. I almost said no. I went anyway, because some part of me needed to see, plainly, what Priya had only described in the abstract. Her kitchen table was the same one it had always been. Scarred oak, a lace runner Margaret had actually helped her pick out at a craft fair years back. She'd laid her retirement statements out across it when I arrived, unprompted, proud of them in the particular way people are proud of a decision they believe was smart. I want you to see something, she said, sliding a folder toward me. I finally moved the last of it. The whole thing, Walter. 31 years at the school district, and I put almost all of it into phase 2. She looked up at me, glowing in a way that made my chest hurt. Ethan says by next spring it could be worth nearly double. And with your name behind it, I mean, I know how careful you've always been about money. If you trusted enough to put your reputation on it, that was good enough for me. I looked down at the numbers. It wasn't a fortune by the standards of a hedge fund or a private equity shop. But it was everything Renata Cole had, the entire accumulated weight of 3 decades of grading papers and packing her own lunch and driving a car 12 years past when she could have afforded a new one. It was sitting, right now, on a foundation of forged paper that I alone knew was rotten. Renata, I started, and then didn't know how to finish it. Every version of the sentence in my head ended with her losing everything before I'd even had the chance to build something that might catch her on the way down. You look like you want to tell me something, she said, gently, the way she did. I want you to promise me something instead, I said. If anything changes with Harbor Point, anything at all, you call me before you do another thing with your money. Not Ethan. Me, she laughed a little, not understanding, waving a hand like I was being an overprotective old friend. Walter, it's a real estate project, not a horse race. What could possibly change? I didn't answer that. I couldn't, not without telling her everything, and I wasn't ready, not because I didn't trust her, but because the moment I told one person, I'd be choosing the timing of a collapse I didn't yet know how to control. Driving home, I made myself do the math the way I would have for any client, coldly, on paper, instead of in the churn of my own guilt. Priya had mentioned, almost in passing, that the developer's public groundbreaking ceremony for Phase 2 was scheduled for a date already circled in red on half the calendars in town, the formal event where Ethan would break ground in front of investors, local officials, and whatever reporter the county paper sent out for the photo. 6 weeks out. 6 weeks during which more people like Renata were still free to sign checks against a lie I hadn't yet found a way to stop without detonating it on top of them. I sat in my study that night with the corkboard in front of me. Red thread running between dates and dollar figures, and understood for the first time that I had built the wrong case. I had built a case to prove Ethan was guilty. What I actually needed was a case that could protect Renata, and the widow at the marina, and however many other names were sitting quietly on that list. Before the world ever found out what I already knew, going to the board tomorrow would feel like justice for exactly 1 day. After that, it would just be wreckage, and I would have signed my name to it as surely as Ethan had signed mine to his. I couldn't move on this the way I'd planned. Not yet. Not until I had something solid enough underneath these people that the truth wouldn't take them down with it, which meant I needed help I didn't yet have. And time I wasn't sure I could still afford. Priya wouldn't move fast, and she wouldn't move alone. That much she made clear the second time we met, this time in her own home office instead of a diner, papers spread across her dining table like the two of us were back on the examiner's board 20 years ago. "I can't be your whole plan, Walter," she said. "I can verify. I can advise. But if this is going to actually protect people instead of just documenting how badly they got hurt, you need someone inside the county who can move money and paperwork the same week the truth comes out, not 6 months later after a lawsuit's crawled through the system." She knew a man named Carl Ostrander, a long-time county economic development officer who'd spent 30 years quietly cleaning up after failed developments nobody wanted their name attached to. Priya trusted him the way she trusted very few people, not because he was flashy, but because he'd never once leaked a confidence in 3 decades of handling other people's disasters. It took 2 weeks of careful, roundabout conversations, Priya first, then a cautious introduction, then a meeting in Carl's office with the blinds drawn, the three of us talking in the flat, careful language of people who understood that every sentence might someday be repeated under oath, before we had something that resembled a plan instead of a hope. The structure Carl proposed wasn't complicated in theory, only difficult in execution. If a public reckoning came at the groundbreaking, the county could have a bridge financing arrangement ready to step in immediately, not to save Ethan's project, but to protect the personal capital investors like Renata had already committed, converting their exposure into secured claims against the property itself rather than unsecured losses in a collapsing private placement. It meant Carl calling in favors with 2 regional lenders who owed the county goodwill from other projects. It meant Priya quietly flagging Harbor Point's file for a compliance review that would trigger the moment, and not 1 second before, the fraud became public. It meant timing everything against a single date already circled on my corkboard in red, the groundbreaking ceremony, 6 weeks out, now closing to 2. I told myself this was the responsible path. Some nights, it felt more like standing at the edge of something and calling careful preparation a kind of courage. Dana came to the house alone again on a Wednesday evening, the baby asleep at home with her sister watching him, and she didn't sit down right away. She stood at the kitchen counter with her arms crossed, like she was bracing for something. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said. "Not the version you think I can handle. Whatever it actually is." I thought about protecting her from it the way I'd been protecting Renata. And then I thought about what that kind of protection had already cost everyone in this story, myself included. So I told her. The forgery. The scope of it. What I now knew about Cedar Ridge, though I kept some of Ethan's confidence intact, enough that I wasn't the one who broke it first. I told her about Priya, about Carl, about the plan taking shape to protect people like Renata before any of this became public. She was quiet for a long time after that. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone thin. "I have bank statements. Ethan doesn't know I've seen them. He thinks I don't look at the joint account anymore, not since I stopped working after the baby. But there's money moving in and out of an account I don't recognize. Going back almost a year. Amounts that match some of what you're describing." She looked up at me. "I have a son now, Walter. I need to know if I'm about to lose everything because of decisions I never made and didn't know about." "You won't," I told her, with more certainty than I actually possessed. "Whatever happens to Ethan, I am not going to let it fall on you and that baby. That much I can promise you." She didn't fully believe me, I could see that, but she nodded anyway, the way people do when a promise is the only solid thing being offered in a room full of uncertain ones. Before she left, she gave me something I hadn't asked for, the approximate dates and amounts from that unfamiliar account. Written on a torn piece of notebook paper, her handwriting tight and careful, like she'd rehearsed the numbers in her head the whole drive over, it matched. Every figure lined up almost perfectly with gaps in my own ledger, closing loopholes I hadn't been able to explain. Dana had just handed me, without knowing it, the last piece connecting Cedar Ridge's old debt directly to Harbor Point's forged guarantees, proof the fraud wasn't a single bad decision but a structure Ethan had been building and rebuilding for over a year. 3 days after that, I nearly lost the whole quiet architecture of the plan in a single afternoon. Priya called Carl's office to confirm a document request. Using a private line she'd used 100 times without incident. Ethan happened to be in the county building that same hour, chasing down a permitting question for Phase 2, and he caught sight of her name on the visitor sign-in sheet at the front desk, an old family friend, a bank compliance officer, meeting with an economic development officer, with no obvious reason tying the three of us together. He called me that evening, his voice too light, too careful, the tone of a man testing the edges of something he suspected but couldn't yet prove. "Funny thing," he said. "Ran into Priya Shah's name at the county office today. Small town, I guess." A pause, just a beat too long. "You two still close? We've known each other 30 years, Ethan." "It's not exactly a conspiracy, no," he said. "No, of course not." But I could hear him not quite believing it, and I understood, in that moment, exactly how little time I actually had left to work in the shadows before he either panicked or moved to protect himself in some way none of us had planned for. I sat alone in my study that night longer than I meant to, the corkboard behind me nearly full now, red thread running between names and dates like the arteries of something that had grown far larger than the quiet forgery I'd first found on a spring afternoon. On the desk in front of me sat a photograph I hadn't looked at in weeks, Margaret at the marina. 30 years younger, laughing at something just out of frame, her hands shading her eyes against a sun that had long since set on both of us. I thought about her signature on that construction guarantee, a woman who had never once, in 40 years of marriage, signed anything without reading it twice. I thought about what she would have said to me if she'd been sitting across the table instead of smiling out of a photograph, whether she'd have told me to burn the whole project down that first week, or whether she'd have told me, the way she always did, to be patient and be right rather than fast and be reckless. I decided, looking at her face, that I was doing this the way she would have wanted. Carefully. Completely. For the people who trusted us, not just for the satisfaction of being proven correct. 2 days later, Carl confirmed the bridge financing was fully arranged and ready to activate the moment it was needed. Priya's compliance flag was set, quiet and dormant, waiting on a single trigger. Dana's numbers had closed the last gap in my case. The groundbreaking ceremony for Harbor Point's second phase was now 2 days away, and for the first time since that letter had landed with Renata's voice on the shore road months before, I felt something close to ready. The morning of the ceremony came in gray and still, fog sitting low over the water the way it does up here before the wind decides which way the day is going to break. I stood in my closet a long time choosing what to wear, which felt absurd given what I was about to do, and then didn't feel absurd at all. Some part of me understood I was dressing for the last formal appearance of the man I used to be, careful, precise, a man who let the paperwork do the talking. Priya met me in the parking lot before anyone else arrived, her phone already in hand, the compliance flag she'd set weeks earlier now live and waiting on a single call. Carl was already down by the site, walking the temporary stage with a county badge on his belt like he had every legitimate reason to be there, which he did. Nobody but the three of us knew what the morning actually held. Harbor Point's second phase site sat right at the water's edge, a cleared stretch of shoreline strung with new bunting and a podium that hadn't existed a week ago. By 9, the folding chairs were most of the way full. Frank Delgado from the hardware store, 2 women from my church, the couple who ran the marina, Renata near the front in a blue cardigan, her retirement folder no doubt still sitting on that scarred kitchen table at home, already spent in her mind on a future that didn't exist. Dana stood near the back with the baby on her hip, and when our eyes met across the crowd, she gave me the smallest nod, the kind you give someone right before you both step off a ledge together. Ethan worked the crowd like he'd worked every room his whole adult life, shaking hands, laughing at something a county commissioner said, glancing toward the podium every few minutes like a man checking a watch he didn't want anyone to see him checking. He hadn't spotted me yet. When he finally did, halfway through his opening remarks about vision and legacy and building something a town could be proud of, I watched the practiced warmth in his face flicker, just slightly, the way a light flickers before a storm knocks the power out for good. I waited until he reached the part of his speech where he thanked the project's guarantors by name. My name. That was the moment I stood, Ethan. I said, loud enough to carry but not shouting, the same register I'd used on hostile witnesses for 30 years. Before you go further, I think these people deserve to see what they're actually guaranteeing. The crowd's attention swung toward me in that particular way a room turns when it doesn't yet know if it's watching a family disagreement or something worse. I held up the folder Priya had helped me prepare, copies only, the originals already filed that morning with the state licensing board the instant I'd given Priya the nod. The construction guarantee bearing Margaret's signature. The private placement memorandum. The permit disclosure with my forged license number sitting under language I'd never written. "My name is on these documents," I said. "So is my late wife's. Neither of us signed them. Neither of us knew they existed until 4 months ago, when I found the first one myself." I looked out at Renata, who had gone very still in her blue cardigan, and at Frank, and at the Marina couple, and made myself say the rest anyway, because the whole point of the last 6 weeks had been making sure I could say it without their world ending on the spot. "I want you to know, before anything else, that your investments are not exposed to this. As of this morning, Harbor Point's investor capital is secured against the property itself through an arrangement with the county and 2 regional lenders. You will not lose what you put in. I made sure of that before I ever stood up here." The murmur that ran through the chairs wasn't panic. It was confusion first, then something closer to relief, and underneath both of those, a slow dawning understanding of exactly what Ethan had built and what it had nearly cost them. Ethan hadn't moved from the podium. For a moment I thought he might try to talk his way through it, the way he tried with Frank and half the town for weeks. Instead, something in him seemed to give way all at once, not collapse exactly, but surrender, the particular stillness of a man who has run out of rooms to talk his way out of. "It's true," he said, into a microphone that carried it to every folding chair on that shoreline. "All of it. I forged my father's credentials. I used his name, and my mother's, without their knowledge, because I was terrified of failing again, and I told myself I'd fix it before anyone found out." His voice cracked on the last word, and I watched Dana close her eyes, the baby's head tucked against her shoulder. "I'm sorry. That doesn't undo any of it. But it's true, he didn't run. I'll give him that." He stood there while Carl came up to formally begin explaining the transition of the project's financing to the assembled investors, while Priya's phone lit up with the confirmation that the compliance review had officially opened, while 2 county officials exchanged the kind of look that meant paperwork neither of them wanted to file was about to get filed anyway. Renata found me afterward, not angry, mostly stunned, holding my arm the way she had at Margaret's funeral. "You could have told me sooner," she said, and I told her the truth, that I'd needed the ground under her to be solid before I ever let her feel it shake, and that I was sorry it had taken this long to build. The weeks that followed were quieter than the ceremony itself, in the way a fever breaks quiet after it burns hottest. The state board moved on Ethan's forged credentials within the month, and Lakeshore Regional's own internal review referred the guarantee fraud for further action shortly after. There was no dramatic sentencing, no reporters camped outside my porch. There was a license revocation, a restitution schedule Ethan would be paying against for years, and a civil settlement with the bank that ate most of what remained of Harbor Point's operating capital. Cedar Ridge's old debt, it turned out, had never really gone away, it had just been hiding behind a newer, prettier lie, and now both lies came due together. Ethan sold his stake in what remained of the project to cover part of it. He kept his marriage, if barely, and he kept his son. Dana came by the house one evening in early winter, alone again, the baby asleep in the car seat by the door. She didn't sit down this time either. "He's in counseling," she said. "Real counseling. Not the kind he does for show. I don't know if that fixes what he did. I don't think it does, not all the way. But I wanted you to hear it from me instead of around town. I'm glad," I told her, and meant it, though I understood by then that glad and healed were 2 very different words. Ethan came only once, on a gray afternoon in December, standing on my porch the way he used to as a boy waiting to be let in after curfew. He didn't ask for forgiveness. I think some part of him had finally learned that forgiveness isn't a thing you can negotiate the way you negotiate a construction loan. He asked instead if he could keep coming around, slowly, without expecting anything from me in return. I told him he could, on the condition that nothing between us would ever again depend on my name doing work he hadn't asked me to do. He nodded like a man accepting terms he knew were fair, even if they weren't the terms he wanted. I took the corkboard down myself. On a Sunday, the red thread coiled into a coffee can I set out for the recycling. The house went quiet again the way it had been before any of this started, except it wasn't the same quiet. It didn't feel like waiting for something to go wrong. It felt earned, the way Margaret's side of the desk still looked exactly as she'd left it, and the way Renata's retirement was still, somehow, intact down the road. I sat by the window that evening and watched the last of the light go gray over the lake. And understood, without needing to say it out loud to anyone, that I hadn't gotten my son back the way I once might have hoped. What I had instead was steadier, and maybe truer to what 30 years in the law had actually taught me, that protecting people well rarely looks like winning, and that peace, when it finally comes, tends to arrive quiet, and asks for nothing in return.